In this short film, we look at different approaches to planning community capacity building, be that with one particular community group, several groups, with community leaders and representatives, or looking across a whole district or borough. In particular, we look at a method called assessing community strengths that will help practitioners working in neighbourhoods to support groups to identify their capacity building needs. Planning community capacity building. What does it mean in practice? There's at least 4 options. I'm sure there's more, but let's just keep it simple. First of all, with one community group. You might actually want to work just with one group and help them look, a bit more carefully or systematically at their support and development needs. Or it might be with individuals. It might be people who are in some way acting as leaders in the community, or representatives where they're from a group but involved on a partnership or a forum or a network as a representative. Or it could be where you've got a range of groups in a neighbourhood who all want to get involved in some way, or even across a whole district where you're talking a bit more about a strategy on capacity building, long term, maybe 5 years, something like that. So just want to touch on some of these. This is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through different ways of planning capacity building. So just an example of working with leaders or individuals as representatives. Certainly it can be helpful to help people be clearer about what the roles are about being a representative. There is some research available from the National Association of Voluntary Community Action, NAVCA, where they did a research project about 3 years ago on what are people carrying out as representatives, what roles they're carrying out, and the tasks involved, and some of the skills involved, and how do they relate to other leaders like elected members and so on. So that's areas that can be looked at. So what about if it was a range of community groups in one neighbourhood? How could we assess the overall level of community strengths in that whole neighbourhood? What approach could we use in order to do that? What methods could we use to collect information? Particularly here, we're talking about the community groups in a neighbourhood. If we just for a minute focus on, if you like, collective activity rather than individuals, or rather, the other indicators like about health or crime, but actually look specifically at what you could call the level of community organisation or level of community strength. If I could just show you one way of doing it. It was in one particular part of Bradford. Let me just tell you briefly a little bit about Bradford. It's Bradford District, 500,000 population, a big city and a large semi-rural area. New Deal for Communities, a regeneration scheme for 10 years started there. This was about 10 years ago. And the area is called the Trident area. This is inner city Bradford. 10,000 people live in the Trident area, multicultural area called West Bowling. Some of the most deprived wards in England, literally second and third most deprived in the whole of England at the time. So we started by kind of mapping what was already going on in the area, quite literally what groups were there, particularly small scale groups. So with working with some groups in the area for starters, we then got to know other groups. So we spent a bit of time just really getting to know and building up a list of groups in the area. Some of them were very small scale and very isolated. I went to a Hindu temple I mentioned earlier on this morning. I was the first council officer to have ever visited it, and they were delighted to have kind of contact they wanted. They felt very on the edge of things, So having done that, we then decided to do it in a little bit more detail, and we only did this with the backing of the groups in the area. We did 3 or 4 different events to ask people whether they wanted to be a part of it, and really we got their kind of approval to be able to carry out a neighbourhood-based assessment. And we thought that was the first most important part of this, was to get local backing on it rather than just impose some kind of assessment or survey or whatever. In order to do it, we used the 4 building blocks because we thought that was a useful way of breaking down what this was all about. So we had a questionnaire, and the questions focused on the building blocks. You can send you a copy if you like. We actually managed to get round 35 out of 50 groups in the area, which is quite a high level of coverage, if you like, on a survey. It took quite a bit of time. It wasn't just postal. A lot of it was visits, workshops, informal meetings, follow-up phone calls, some one-to-one informal kind of interviews with people and so on. A lot of tea drinking. I drank a lot of tea during this period. And we got a lot of help as well from groups in the area who involved other groups, and word of mouth and all that sort of thing. It was really quite a build-up to it. So we sat in a back room for half a day, analysed all the facts and figures from these 35 completed survey forms. We didn't take it any further. We then presented it back to the groups. What we wanted to do was that the groups would interpret the data. In other words, this was in a room, something like this one. We had loads of posters all around the room, all split up into the 4 blocks basically, and people went round and read the findings and so on, but didn't actually come to a lot of conclusions. It was just like the hard and soft data on what was happening in the area. We also gave options of 5 different levels of community organisation, and the groups in the room, that was actually about 50 people were there, chose what level they thought they were at. So it wasn't us doing it, they chose their own level kind of thing. I'll just tell you briefly about the levels. It's on one of these here. Yeah, it sort of went, level 1 was the least level of community organisation. Which would be, for example, level 1 would be low on confidence, groups quite isolated, low level of participation in terms of coming to consultation meetings and so on, little formal representation on committees or partnerships or whatever. So there's not many people kind of coming forward to have a say in the area. And also poor turnout, you know, at meetings and events and so on. So low level of community activity generally, you could see at level 1. And people not very confident about it. Like some areas might have a whole history of community organising and the leadership's quite well developed. People are used to organising things, whereas level 1 would be low on confidence around that. And maybe the support as well. Half of it was about looking at what the support might there be available. So support on a level 1 area would be quite patchy, quite uncoordinated. Maybe the CVS is doing a bit, maybe 1 or 2 other organisations, but not very coordinated in terms of that. At the other extreme, you could say level 5, you know, hope there's some areas around that are like this, but it's ambitious. Overall, a well-developed community sector, you know, that grassroots layer of activity and organisation. Training based on needs, not just scattergun, hope for the best, will people turn up, but really building on needs and strengths in an area, and building in particular, appreciating talents and skills and ideas already being used, you know, to bring that out. The potential that's already there is being recognised and brought out. Hopefully funding is fairly secure and practical support for groups is available and coordinated. So it's not just a competition between people getting in there, but there's some actual local coordination that groups have had a say in, groups have contributed to what is going on. So we've got 5 levels, fairly rough and ready, and obviously you'd get different variations between level 1 and level 5 in the 5 categories, if you like, that we invited people to have a say about. A lot of discussion, a lot of debate went on. We spent a lot of time going around the room looking at these posters and all the data and everything. And there was then a kind of vote, you know, just a voting system, easily done. And people decided they were at level 2. We then used the rest of the meeting to do some action planning to help the area move to level 3. So it would be moving up a level. On the 4 blocks, we just split up into 4 groups around the room, and each group focused on a particular block. How can we move the area? How can we move our neighbourhood to go up a level in terms of its level of organisation? Just want to sort of go up a level, if you like, to the whole district. You know, if you're talking about 500,000 people or so on, I don't know, what's the population of Falkirk? Right, okay, so a bit smaller, but you know, how do you do this with a larger population of 57,000 or 500,000 population. This is one example from Bradford that I'd like to tell you about. And it was a strategy that covered 5 years of building community strengths. And certainly I was very impressed that so many different groups and organisations, public sector organisations, got involved in this. It really shook things up across the city for quite a while. When it started, over 200 groups turned up at 2 or 3 kind of festival type conferences, one or two of which were in the town hall, and many people who'd never been in the town hall before came along, including all sorts of teams, like groups rather like a meditation group, and people from a music group and dance teams and all sorts of things. You know, it wasn't essentially the normal range of groups who were getting involved in it. We were looking at building capacity both in communities and in the public sector. So it was a partnership approach to capacity building. There was 4 joint working groups were formed from these conferences, which involved like tenants leaders, community activists, residents leaders, faith leaders, sitting alongside people from public sector organisations on working committees. They met for 3 or 4 months actually to look at kind of different needs and so on. Each group assessed the needs for their particular building block. So it was split around the 4 building blocks. The whole lot was combined into a strategy that for 5 years that got backing from the then local strategic partnership. We thought that was very important, that it got proper formal backing basically. And then in terms of the implementation, voluntary community sector groups or representatives sort of led on a lot of the different initiatives that went on, with public services actively involved and supporting it. So that's what happened, and it was an exciting time basically. You know, before then the voluntary sector had felt they were a bit left out. They'd been through quite a difficult period, and creating this joint strategy between the council, public services and the voluntary community sector was a way of kind of rebuilding some of the goodwill. I'd like to think even now, 10 years later, that a lot of that goodwill is still there. You know, that's what I'm told by people, that established relationships, a new way of working that have kind of lasted to this day. And it meant that a lot of the initiatives had some sort of focus to them. So that was a bit of a rush tour, but you get the idea that planning capacity building, it can be with one group, it can be with a number of leaders or representatives, individuals, active citizens, it can be with a range of community groups in a neighbourhood, or it could be at a more kind of strategic level, longer term, over 5 years, say, at district or borough kind of level. Ambitious, not easy. You know, there's a lot of work goes into this to do this well. Always good to, at a fairly early stage, get people on board in terms of, you know, stakeholders, funders and so on, you know, to be able to involve people in the sort of early on in terms of their ownership in it. Obviously, using the 4 blocks and hopefully being clear on the objectives. I mean, we've got some examples from Bradford on what those objectives might actually look like in terms of the 4 blocks. Okay, so hopefully that's enough on planning for now.
To plan any event in the community, a lot of time and effort needs to go in right at the very start of the planning exercise. You actually have to think about who you're going to engage with, who is your audience in the community, and what is the purpose of the event. Is it disseminating information? Is it starting that conversation? Is it collating information for statistical purposes? You really have to think about that first of all. Then think about which partners are going to get round the table. So get all the relevant partners round the table, because they too have inroads into all the different areas of the community, because you want to make sure that the planning demonstrates that you're opening it to as many people in the community. You're not missing anybody out. Everybody has a fair and equal opportunity to engage with it, to get involved as much as they want, because some groups will not engage as much as others, we know that, but they have to have that opportunity. Lots of people, when they plan an event, think mainly about the building, whether it's got enough car parking facilities. You really have to think about the location of the building. You know, is it near the bus routes? Can someone with a disability get a taxi there? Is there car parking? What are the facilities like in the venue? You know, can you have breakout rooms? And then you actually think of the format of the day, the information that you want to get from the community. You know, will they engage with you if you do a conference where you're asking folk to stick their hands up or stand up and ask a question, or is it better to break them up into groups where you have facilitators that can actually facilitate specific activities so that people can dip in and dip out depending on what their experience and what their skills and knowledge are. There are lots of different ways you can communicate with them before the event, so you can ask them to complete a questionnaire, you can give them the agenda for the day and ask them to actually think about specific items or specific topics so that when they come they feel more prepared, because then you're more likely to get more information out of them because you're putting them at ease. For many people in the community, while they're very active in their own community, engaging with strategic partners is maybe something that they would shy away from because they've never had to engage with them before. So you have to play, or you have to think of what their strengths are and develop the event around the strengths of the community and who you want to engage. Because if you miss one area of the community out, it really spoils what your results are, what you're trying to do, because you have to get everyone to buy into what the whole event is about, because hosting an event is just one step on the ladder to what you're actually trying to achieve in the community.
How can we plan community capacity building using the 4 building blocks?